thank you very much for having me. I've had a wonderful time so far. I want to thank Xenia and SEGM for inviting me. I also want to just thank everybody here for doing what you're doing, which is incredibly moving and inspirational to me. And I don't say things like that very often, but I have been really touched listening to it all. I'm so glad that you're all doing what you're doing. Okay, so as you can see, I'm afraid, it's more autonomy and more informed consent, but hopefully from a different, I mean, I've really learned from Moti and Linda and others, but I'll bring my own approach to it. Okay, so I want to start with a case from Brighton that Hannah Barnes, who is here, has reported on recently in the New Statesman. And this is a doctor, a trans-identified doctor called Dr. Sam Hall, who is now under investigation by NHS England for activity carried out at a GP practice in Hove, which is in Brighton, basically. So Hannah's written, as of May 2025, up to 139 children under 18 were in receipt of either irreversible hormones or drugs to block their puberty or both, from Brighton's WellBN practice. Most of those receiving cross-sex hormones were female, some were as young as 13. And as Barnes notes, children this young have never been approved for hormones in NHS specialist gender services. So effectively, this doctor was not following the mainstream approach in the UK, even before the Cass report. So, as I just said, the clinic is now under investigation, finally, although people have been whistleblowing about it for ages. And the terms of reference of the investigation say there are indications that patient harm may have occurred, have now emerged. This relates to the age of individuals being prescribed exogenous hormones and other medications, and the apparent absence of advice or support from paediatric and/or child mental health clinicians with expertise in the broader assessment of young people with complex mental health and developmental challenges, as well as from expert paediatric endocrinologists. So I just want to draw attention to the fact that they have noticed, obviously, that there's harm here, and then there's this absence of experts. So Hall, who has given extensive interviews about this, so you can look them up on YouTube, has been open for ages about the fact that the model being followed is the informed consent model, or what is called the informed consent model. So this is a quote from Hall. This isn't about you having to have an assessment to see if you're trans. You shouldn't have to jump through hoops. You shouldn't have to explain yourself to anyone. You certainly shouldn't be psychiatrically analysed. Hormones should be freely available because we can and do know how to do this safely. This is essentially reproductive rights. The informed consent model of care is all about bodily autonomy and respect for your body being your own and the choices you make about your body being your own. And that applies to anything in healthcare. All of modern Western medicine is predicated on some quite patriarchal and paternalistic principles that the doctor knows best and they will decide for you what the right thing to do is. So you see in very stark real-time context how the informed consent model is being used and thought about in this case. Okay, so I thought, well, I'll go and find out what the informed consent model is. And I think because of its name, it's easy to slide over the details because you think, oh, all they're asking for is informed consent. But actually, they're not saying that informed consent of the patient is necessary to receive treatment. They're saying it's sufficient to receive treatment. And it's important to bear that in mind in what follows. The patient's informed consent is enough to get what the patient wants. All they need to do is be informed of all the risks and benefits and everything that is known to consent, and then they should have the treatment, basically. Now, it's the usual experience when you're investigating this stuff. You think, oh, this is crazy. Nobody could have possibly defended this. Then you go and find that, of course, there are thousands of articles defending this, and this is one of them, and it's by Florence Ashley and others whose first names I don't know. So Ashley et al. Differentiate between three versions of the ICM, the informed consent model. The strong one, which is the one I've just given, and the one that Hall is obviously following. Patient's informed consent is sufficient for provision of treatment. Then there's a weak one, according to them. The patient's autonomy is centred, whatever that means, but an assessment of gender identity and/or gender dysphoria by a doctor is also required for provision. And then there's another one called a no letters model. No referral letter from an external mental health professional is required, but eligibility for hormones remains based on a more comprehensive assessment, basically. So I'm going to leave aside the last one because it doesn't seem to me to fit particularly. And I'll just note that as far as I can see, the weak one will just collapse into the strong one quite quickly if there is a disagreement between the patient and the doctor in the second one, the weak one, and the patient's autonomy gets centered, then that seems to me like it's providing a decision procedure about what to do in those disagreements, and it's going to say, well, you should default to the patient's autonomous decision. So the middle one, the weak one, is very vague about what would happen if the patient and the doctor actually disagreed. But let's just focus on the first one, the strong one, to bear in mind again that this is just that the patient has all the information that they need. They say, yes, I want it, so they should get it from the health system. Now, you could object to that indirectly by pointing out, especially when you're talking about children, that they don't have informed consent. And we heard a few of those objections. We spent quite a lot of time talking about that earlier. So you could say Hall's patients, I think rightly, could not give informed consent because either because they don't have capacity, so they can't understand the implications of what they're hearing, or you could say because there's not enough information, as Xenia and other colleagues, and Stephen Levine and other colleagues have argued, they're not being told the right sorts of things. So they don't, in fact, have the information required to have informed consent. So you can definitely object on those things. But I want to focus on it directly. And what I want to do is to think about it as applies to adults, because there still seems something wrong with it. Even if you've got an adult who is capable of consent and the adult has all the information that is possibly available, it still seems to me there's something wrong with just saying that the adult's informed consent is enough to justify provision of whatever treatment they wish. So if we find out what's wrong with it in the adult case, then, as philosophers say, a fortiori, it will be even more wrong in the child's case, where all these other problems are there. So from now on, I'm just talking about sort of pure, strong version of the ICM as it applies to fully functioning adults with lots of information about what's going to happen if they have this treatment, whatever that treatment is, even if we know that in the real world, in gender medicine, there isn't that evidence base. Okay, so I want to say, why is this plausible? What is happening? What is happening to medicine that this is becoming more attractive? And I also want to relate it to another field, which I've just finished writing a book about, which is assisted dying. Because you find, I'm going to say, something very like the informed consent model applying in the case of whether doctors should help people commit suicide or be directly killed through euthanasia. But before I get there, I want to focus on a paper that's already come up today by Moti was talking about it. And that's that paper, that weird paper by Oosthoek, or whatever how you pronounce that, that Anna Lou de Vries is a co-author on. So normally I would think you could just ignore this paper, but the fact that, that she's on it is quite worrying. And as you will know who she is. So this argument advances what they call the trans-negativity model. And that's supposed to be like a positive framing. And I think it's just it's obviously a route to strong ICM, strong informed consent model by another route. So the paper asks, what are the effective outcomes for gender affirmative medical treatment? And these authors want to challenge the standard account of what counts as effective, what counts as improvement, and why we should be giving this stuff to kids. They say the standard account, the old-fashioned account that they want to dismantle, is that transition should lead to improvement, implying that each step in the transition process mitigates negative feelings, ultimately curing gender dysphoria and improving the well-being of the transgendered individual. And they say improvement is standardly understood in terms of a narrative. You start with doing bad, distress, then you get gender affirmative treatment, then you move towards a static gender identity, a binary presentation, then you get doing better, overall improvement, and you get the absence of regret. And that's like the ideal. But their alternative model is the transnegativity model. The justification of giving hormones and puberty blockers should not be conditional on the logic of improvement. Transnegativity challenges the dominant discourse that this treatment must necessarily alleviate distress and lead to improvement in overall well-being and functioning in order to be justified. I know this sounds odd, but let's just go with it. So, as Moti mentioned, this paper cites Andrea Long-Chu, arguing that the only prerequisite for gender affirmative treatment should be a demonstration of desire. This is for children. Okay. They also quote another scholar, transition doesn't have to be wholly curative or even minimally happy-making in order for it to be imperative. Now, they say there may be alternative ethical frameworks for justifying the provision of puberty blockers, etc., for adolescents by suggesting an analogy with abortion and birth control, saying that in those cases, effectiveness is measured by how well they help individuals achieve their embodiment goals, mentioned before. In this view, healthcare is provided and justified on the basis of personal desire and autonomy. So that's very much the strong informed consent model, although they actually haven't mentioned being informed, but let's just assume charitably that they want the patient to be very informed about all the risks. Now, another factor of this view, or at least a factor that goes along with this view, that is sort of emerging from the discourse, is people are starting to talk about the right to regret. So in the same paper, the absence of regret, we are told, is not necessarily a goal for gender-affirming treatment. And that fits with this trend noted by Eliza Mondegreen in her blog. She describes a 2024 WPATH speaker saying that there's this thing called the dignity of risk. Adolescents have a right to regret bad decisions. There's dignity in being able to make decisions you might regret later, even if it means making a quote-unquote bad decision. This is a quote from this speaker, who Eliza doesn't name, so I can't tell you who it is. Sexual development is not just one thing. It's your body parts, it's your space, it's your gender, it's the way you express your gender, it's your physical development of puberty. Like, can people take risks with all of these different areas as a normal part of developing your sense of self as a human? So the right to regret is the sort of thing that comes out of the dignity of risk. It's this idea that, like, an autonomous person can make decisions they wish they hadn't later. We've all done things where we're like, oh, that was not great, right? But that's just part of being a person, part of learning and growing. Okay, so you've got to remember what they are actually talking about. It's not just getting your ears pierced or, getting off with the wrong person. They're talking about irrevocable bodily change with all the consequences that we suspect. So, what's going on here? Now, you might say, well, where did they get that from? And even in terms of their own logic, like, why would you pivot from some people regret, some people are detransitioning, some people seem harmed by these treatments, to, oh, well, maybe being harmed and how well someone feels afterwards are not the right measures to judge the effectiveness of this treatment. Maybe we need to find other measures. So they're moving really from an is, which is a description of the fact that lots of people seem harmed and that they are not happy with the treatment they've had, to an ought, which is, well, we should carry on, but for a different reason. Now, cynics might suggest that that is desperate. It's a desperate attempt to salvage something from the original treatment model, motivated reasoning, cognitive dissonance, or whatever, that, there must be a good rationale for what we're doing. And if it isn't the thing that we originally said, then it must be something else. So now we're satisfying autonomy. We're giving people what they want, and that's a moral good to give people what they want or something. But I just want to now make some basic observations about this model, which I'm sure you can all work out for yourselves. It pretty much eliminates, as far as I can see, the role of the doctor as the expert or the medical authority with the capacity to exercise his or her judgment in a way that affects the outcome for the patient. It presents reasonable disagreements between the patient and the doctor about the appropriateness of a treatment as paternalism, like automatically paternalism. That, you know, any intervention that differs from the patient's own judgment will be paternalistic. It will be imposing the will of the doctor on you, the autonomous person who knows what's best for you. And I think if you think about this as applied to the whole of medicine, because, I mean, it sounds crazy, but lots of things sound crazy in this world. And as I'm going to say, I think there's signs that this model is elsewhere in the medical system. So if we just think, okay, like, let's think our thoughts through to the end, like, what would the medical profession look like if we use this as the measure of whether a patient should get some treatment or not? I can see it like being like the doctor, like being like a chatbot. In fact, they'll probably just go to AI and get a big long list of risks and benefits. They'll read them all out to the patient. They'll do a little quick capacity check. And then they'll say, right, what do you want to do? And then they'll just give you the thing. And that, you know, that seems to be the kind of model we're going for. And of course, that shifts ethical responsibility from the doctor to the patient. The patient bears all the responsibility, because the idea is, well, you knew. I told you the risks. You said you understood the risks. You chose this. So now, from now on, you can't blame me if it goes wrong, because this is the model. The model is that you get to choose, but then you bear all the costs yourself if it goes wrong. And it also obviously tells the doctor to ignore his or her own scruples about what they're doing, because that's not their role anymore. You know, they're not there for that. And as Mondegreen points out, medical experimentation by doctors is being treated in this model as risky, developmentally appropriate self-experimentation. You know, you're just trying out new things like a crazy adolescent, and it's all part of a healthy project. Or not just adolescent, like crazy 50-year-old, but, you know, whatever. You're just exerting your own autonomy to get the outcomes you want, and that, if it goes wrong, well, that's just part of life. Sort of thing. As has been very clear, this, because it prioritizes autonomy, although I'm going to say something skeptical about whether it really does in a minute, it's very casual about the other principles that are classically thought of as important in medical ethics. So beneficence and nonmaleficence are demoted because the patient has a right to choose things that harm herself or that aren't good for herself. And I think that some in the gender affirmative world might kind of square that circle by just sort of fantasizing that the patient always knows what's best for themselves, which is of course what you hear often. You know, only I can tell you really what's good for me. But that's an attempt to get around this problem that clearly that's not true of any human. So therefore just missing out the fact that you're going to have to, that patients are going to be harmed, basically. Okay, so now I'd like to say something about the supposed connection with patient autonomy. And this is a point that Moti made, but I really do think it's worth making this again. The classical liberal accounts of the liberty as a right, or autonomy, if that's different, so something like self-government, they're negative rights. They're rights to, like, imagine a kind of imaginary fence around you that stops other people coming in. You want to make your decisions about your life, your family, classically, your property, your hobbies, whatever the domain is. You lot can't tell me what to, well, you can tell me what to do, but you can't force me. You can't come in, you can't get through my fence to coerce me into doing something that I don't want to do, or that I have chosen not to do. But so that it's a right to be left alone, okay? So that's non-interference, it's negative. It's not a right that you must help me. It's not a right to demand that you come in and give me something, because that actually arguably infringes on your rights to make your own decisions. So I can enter into private contracts with you and where we both agree that we will do something together, but then that's different. So that's, I think, the basis of the classic medical ethics principle of autonomy. It's the right not to have treatments imposed against your will. You know, doctors can't just do whatever they like to you, and quite right. But that does not automatically translate into doctors have to give you what you want. That is completely different. So something to bear in mind. Now, others haven't raised this, I don't think, but there is a sort of a kind of more modern add-on to theories of human rights, or a more modern approach which talks about positive rights as well. And I suppose you could sort of try and finesse positive rights in this area. So some theorists have argued that in order to be truly a self-governing individual, there's certain basic capacities you need, and that requires certain goods. Like you need enough food to have enough energy to do things. You need enough water. You need shelter. There's some basic goods everyone has a right to, although it's not a right of non-interference anymore. It's a right to be, it imposes a duty on the state to provide them so that you can then realize your other projects, whatever your self-governed projects are. There's some things that every human needs in order to do that. So there, that's that. But I'm not sure how that's going to fit with the right to get puberty blockers or hormones, when it's very unclear what because it's tied to a story about well-being. You know, you need food and water and shelter because they are good for you. In fact, they're essential for you. And so you need to have some kind of story about puberty blockers and hormones in this case to explain why without them you can't do anything else. And of course, trans activists have tried to supply that by telling you that people will kill themselves if they don't get them, but we know that's not true. So I think that having your autonomy respected, which is the negative version, no one's going to interfere with me, doctors are not going to do invasive procedures on me without my say-so, or the positive version, being enabled to do what I want by given basic goods that are good for my well-being. Neither of those are the same as just getting whatever I want because I want it. That's the toddler approach to autonomy, basically. That's like, you know, why is it a good thing? Because I want it. and hopefully we can't run a medical system on that basis, quite obviously, and nor should we. And I think another giveaway that the value of autonomy is being strategically invoked here, I think, is why should it only apply in gender care? If this is a principle, then it should be rolled out across the board for everything. You know, it should be in cancer care. It should be in every place where doctors give treatments and where there's clashes of just opinion between the patient and the doctor about what's best for them. Why not? Let's just make it all informed consent. Doctors can just put their feet up and list risks, benefits, and then the patient just decides what they want to do. I mean, obviously I'm being sarcastic. So now this is where I'm going to start talking about assisted dying. But one of the things that's so bogus about this as a rhetorical strategy is that the original defense of gender affirming hormones and puberty blockers was that this was a uniquely suffering population, that their well-being was severely hampered by the lack of treatment, that they needed help, they needed medical help, they needed sort of very extreme, radical kinds of help. This was the only way they could be helped. It would relieve their pain and their suffering. And you know, so that was, the cohort was picked out for this treatment because of the suffering. Now that it turns out the suffering is not necessarily alleviated, now we suddenly start talking about autonomy. Well, they've got a right to do it if they want to. Those are two different discourses. Now, you see exactly this just as I said, I've written a book about assisted dying. You see exactly that sort of clash in the growing clamour across Europe and the Anglophone world for organised assisted dying, whether that's, and I prefer to call it assisted death, because it's not, you're not being helped with the dying process, you're being helped with the dead process. Assisted suicide in some places, euthanasia in others. And actually, you know, just as an interesting fact, the places in which gender medicine is very popular, or where, so Holland being the sort of place that started all this, of course, they're very hot on assisted death as well. Canada's another place where they're very hot on assisted death and gender medicine. So I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence, but systems for assisted dying differ across the world, and it'd be way too complicated to try and explain all the differences. But one of the particular features of the Dutch and the Belgian system, and also will be the case in Canada, although they've kind of had a bit of cold feet about this bit, is that they will euthanize people with psychiatric conditions only. So no underlying terminal illness or even life-limiting condition, just on the basis of what they think of as hopeless suffering. And they are euthanizing a small number, but a growing number of 20-year-olds who are being diagnosed with multiple things like OCD, ADHD, autism, BPD. And they are saying, I need to die and I need you to help me. I've exhausted all my other options. We've been through it all now and I just want to die. And then the doctor will not even just assist suicide, but actually kill them. So this is one study from Holland. It said it was looking into these numbers of these people under the age of 24, obviously small numbers, but, you know, small numbers can get big, as we know, especially when suffering expands in the way that we've been seeing that it does. Those who died by assisted dying or suicide were mostly female, had long treatment histories, prominent suicidality. These findings suggest there's an urgent need for more knowledge about persistent death wishes and effective suicide prevention strategies for this high-risk group. I would agree. How are you going to have a suicide prevention strategy where the state is offering you euthanasia is a separate question. But the parallel is that initially the cohort picked out is you're suffering. You know, you're suffering terribly. It's the same in the UK, which is actually debating our law, which we're about to introduce today. Not that in the UK, it's for people with terminal illness, but it's still they're picked out that cohort because they're suffering. It's not random. The idea is you're in pain, you're in terrible pain, somebody needs to help you and alleviate you. So it's a kind of argument for mercy or compassion, which is not freedom. It's completely different. It's like the moral defense of coming to your aid is that you are suffering and I can help. And that's a doctor's role, often. It's the helping profession, as somebody said earlier. But then when it gets pointed out, well, maybe they're not suffering hopelessly. Maybe they can be helped. Or in the case of terminal illness, you know, maybe they're actually not in pain at all. Their relatives are pressuring them to die, or they want to leave their house, or, you know, they've got a history of depression. You know, maybe it's nothing to do with the illness. Then the arguments come back from the assisted dying lobby. But autonomy is their choice. It's their bodies, their choice. They should be able to do. Who are you to say that they can't kill themselves? Now, of course, the thing is, the unfortunate fact is nobody's saying you can't kill yourself. You can kill yourself, unfortunately. I don't want anybody to do it, but it's something that you have in your power to do. So autonomy would be the negative right to be left alone to do the thing you want to do. And I hope nobody, you know, I believe that would be a terrible thing for nearly everybody. But that's not what's being asked for from the health system. It's not leave me alone to end my own life. It's I need doctors to help me do it. That's not something autonomy is going to give you a right to have, as far as I can see. You need another argument as to why you are owed this by the state or by the doctors, paid for by the state. And I also think it's just obviously difficult to justify euthanasia or assisted suicide in terms of a contribution to well-being, because you're not being at all, and because there are other alternatives which are, we could argue about that, but palliative care is a quite sophisticated operation these days and can remove most of the, not all, but many of the traditional sort of stereotypes of end-of-life suffering. Okay, so just zooming out again, what would happen if we moved in this direction, not just for gender medicine and for assisted dying, but more generally? Well, it would destroy the traditional rationale of medicine. So the English National Health Service Act says that the purpose of the NHS, that's our public health system, is to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and in the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of physical and mental illness. In other words, medicine is normally defined as connected to improvement, understood as increases in physical and psychological well-being, beneficence, nonmaleficence are built into the understanding of medicine, and doctors should not be complicit in doing harm. And there are mostly observable markers of well-being: pain, absence of pain, functionality, absence of functionality, depression, presence of it. A lot of it is self-report, but it's not up to the patient, we normally think, to define what counts as benefit or harm to the self. There are like objective or sort of objective markers of benefit and harm that the medical profession decides on together. And this informed consent model is asking for a different conception of medicine, because it's detaching the goal of patient well-being or preventing deterioration from the practice of medicine. And that can only be obscured by the sort of quasi-mystical idea that the patient always knows what's in her own interest and what's in the interests of herself. But that's not true for anyone, including us, obviously. So I just want to finish by asking, in what, why, because you could say, why is this coming? Like, if you take a kind of zoomed out view, why are we so interested in autonomy? And David's paper gave us some clues, Lucy Johnson's paper gave us some clues, but like, in what cultural conditions might it start to look attractive to people that like informed consent models should revolutionize the way that we do medicine from now on? Probably in a culture which prioritizes and celebrates the values, very undefined and vague, but the values of autonomy, choice, freedom, individualism, very vaguely without clarifying what these things mean. We've heard today lots of people seem a bit confused. I don't blame you about what the limits of autonomy are or what it would give you if you had it. Also a culture which emphasizes in the public imagination that medical expertise is hierarchical, myopic, potentially oppressive, full of injustice. If it insists on the value of patients as experts by experience even, as co-producers of knowledge, which tries to level the hierarchy and flatten it all out so that nobody knows any more than anybody else, or at least there's some sort of competing cacophony of different views, and no one can take charge and say, no, actually, I do know better. I've done a degree in this or whatever. You're not allowed to, it's very unfashionable to say things like that anymore. And when I look at our public health system in the UK, it's absolutely full of co-production of knowledge, experts by experience, lived experience, and all the rest of it. And that's all an attempt, I think, to devalue expertise. Also, a culture where it's increasingly unusual for those in authority to take responsibility for harmful mistakes. Because, I don't know why, but it is clearly difficult for those in authority across the political spectrum to take responsibility for mistakes, generating a temptation to develop a model of medicine which puts all the responsibility for mistakes onto the patient, so the doctor just doesn't have to worry about it anymore. Also, where doctors feel disempowered to say no to patients who really, really, really want something, and especially when they've developed a kind of activist culture behind them, arguing that to say no is gatekeeping from the thing they really, really want. And And where there's a lot of money to be made, gender, or a lot of money to be saved, euthanasia, if the treatment risks are passed on to the patient, then you can scale the treatment up. Easy. And probably, I don't know about this one, but I'll give it a go. In areas of medicine where the original problem to be relieved by a proposed treatment is identified wholly by self-report. Gender identity, I am I have a certain gender identity, I have dysphoria, or I want to die, my suffering is intolerable. It's very hard to tell someone, no, your suffering is not intolerable, tolerate it, you'll be fine. It's very unlikely people are going to say that, at least initially. So the initial deference, it seems to me, to the patient's own assessment to set up the condition then sets the tone for what happens next, because it's quite hard when you've already conceded quite a lot of ground in there to then start saying you know what's best. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'll stop there.